Painting eyes on miniatures can be a pain in the eye socket. You gotta be careful and you've gotta be steady, otherwise it'll end up looking like a special fried egg. So here's some beginner methods and tips fluttered throughout the video to grace your miniatures with the ability of sight. I've prepared some heads on sticks earlier, and 10 points goes to Gryffindor if you manage to guess what brand and sprue these guys have come from. Now, we've all heard the term "don't fire till you see the whites in their eyes," and your initial thought may be to paint them white, and something contrasty to make them stand out, like a black. But today we're going to be using a brown and an off-white colour instead, so there's not such a stark difference between the two. Method number 1, the tabletop way. We'll kick off with the basics on this one. Whether you're not feeling too confident in painting eyes yet, or you may just be pushed for time and you need to get some miniatures on the tabletop sharpish. And for the eyes, we're just going to be painting in some of that dark brown into both of the eye sockets. And this will create both a quick shade for the miniature, but also an illusion that we've painted some eyes. Which is a great start, especially if you're going to be gaming with the miniatures, and they'll be a couple feet away from you on the tabletop. But let's say you want to push yourself and actually paint the whites of the eyes and the pupil. Method number 2, dot to dot. I'm gonna bring out the big guns now with this post-it note. The premise with this method is that we're going to paint the socket brown, like what we did in the first instance, but then we're going to add 2 dots of an off-white colour to the sides of each eye. You only need a small amount of paint on the very tip of the brush for this exercise. This is now where you're going to need a steady hand and a very fine tip brush. Speaking of brushes, we're going to be using the Psycho brush by Army Painter. And this is probably the teeniest brush I've ever had, compared to my normal go-to number 1 brush by Winsor & Newton. The nice thing about using this very fine pointed brush is that it makes life a bit easier whilst painting the whites of the eye. Now that's a death stare and a half. If you don't want the miniature to look like a complete psychopath, then you could water down the brown ever so slightly. This will allow it to go into the recesses of the eye socket a little bit easier. And then after we've picked out the whites of the eye, like we did before, it will give it a softer, natural looking feel to it, compared to the previous eyes that we did. Now let's say you want something a little bit more impactful. Let's say you might have a dark elf sorceress or a Medusa, and you want the eyes to be really piercing. Then we can use the black and white paint to give as much contrast as possible. You can then compare this to the Rhinox hide and mummy robes one that we painted earlier, as well as the Rhinox hide that's been slightly watered down, to give us 3 slightly different results by using the same method. Now for a little bit of troubleshooting. By only having a small amount of paint on your bristles, it does dry a little bit quicker. So if the paint is not adhering to the eyeball, then you might need to add a small amount of water to thin down the paint. But on the flip side, don't add too much water, otherwise it will become too liquidy and it will spluff everywhere when you try to paint the model. Now I also want to show you a little tip here that I use for painting tiny details such as eyes. And that's finger positioning for extra stability. I tend to lean my fingertips against each other whilst I'm holding a miniature in my hand. That way it keeps me nice and sturdy whilst I'm painting smaller details. But what about you guys? Throw some ideas into the comments so others can gain insight on how you guys paint as well. Method number 3, the Crosshair. This method again starts with a brown eye socket, however this time we're going to add a white line going horizontally across the eye. This will frame the whites of the eye before we paint a further brown line vertically to create the pupil. And then we'll simply cut back with our skin colour on the brow and the cheek to get rid of any of that brown line excess paint. This method is pretty useful if you've not quite got the eye coordination to paint a perfect dot for a pupil. However, you still have to take your time whilst painting those straight lines. But it can be quite forgiving, as you can just paint around the eye socket with your original skin colour to tidy it up. So sometimes it could be beneficial to paint the eyes completely before adding washes and layers of paint to the flesh tones. Method number 4, the bullseye. We will follow up the same way as we did before with the brown and the white to block in the eye colour, and then we're going to paint a dot right in the middle for the pupil. So this approach is similar to the crosshair method that we did previously, but because we're using a dot for the pupil rather than lines, we're not going to have to tidy up afterwards on the skin. And if you're feeling brave and confident, then you can try this method instead. Now, if you're not too steady with a brush, then this next one might be for you. This 0.1mm fine liner drawing pen has precision written all over it, and it can create the tiniest of dots, perfect for our pupils. With this method, you don't have to worry about the paint drying out on the tip of the brush, and you can take your time to apply some dots. But you don't have to use always a brown or a black for a pupil. Sometimes you might want to add a little bit of colour, like baby Blue Eyes Gollum over here. So now for today's bonus tip for painting eyes. And that is to add a little bit of colour. And this will do a couple of things. It will add some extra detail and interest to a model's face, and it will draw your eye to their eye. But it could also set the mood to a miniature. For example, you could use either a blue or a teal underneath the eye for your monsters or magic casters, or even around the eye as some eyeshadow, or even like a muted green to signify that the miniature is sick or deathly. There's a lot that you can experiment with. So I hope that you've got some ideas of how to tackle painting eyes for your miniatures. And until next time, keep on hobbying.